Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good whatever time of day it is. Thank you for tuning in to Conversations with Dr. Don. For your first-time viewers, Conversations with Dr. Don is an ongoing series of 1 hour standalone talk shows where I interview interesting people like most of you out there about who they are as unique, one-of-a-kind individuals and about whatever it is we have decided to talk about. I always try to get through my first monologue without stumbling, but I always do. My guest this evening is a repeat guest, Dr. Rick Stegenborg, an MD psychiatrist who I've had on a number of times through the years, and will have one again in the future because he's so decidedly interesting and so fun to hang out with, and I keep learning a little something every time he's a guest. Welcome.
Good to be here, Don.
Good to see you. How have you been? How are you right now? How have you been lately?
I've been wonderful because there's something really exciting happening that we're going to talk about today.
Oh, I'm looking forward to it. Yeah, I'm good, and my mood's pretty mellow because Monday morning I will take that big bird in the sky and head for Hawaii for a week.
Oh, sweet.
Just hang out and get sore mouth from eating too much pineapple and papaya and like that, but I'm fine. Yeah, and again, good to see you again. Yeah. So we're gonna need from the notes you gave me to prompt me to ask you questions. We're gonna need 3 hours, but we only got 1 hour, so we're gonna have to cut them down, right? Yeah. As you viewers know, my shows go in two major segments. The first segment is what I call the bio segment, where we talk with the guest about who he is or she is personally, so we have an idea where this guest is coming from and he or she has something to say about anything. And since Rick has been on a number of times in the past, we're going to abbreviate that first half of the show so that we'll have more time to talk about Pledge to Amend. And the work you've been doing on these issues of amending the Constitution and related issues has been just tremendous and outstanding. I know of no one else who has put the amount of energy and time you put into this effort. It's so critically important. I feel good about seeing what you do with it. Thank you.
Thanks, Don. Well, there are lots of other people putting just as much time into it. Some of us are taking different paths, though, and I like to think that the one I'm taking is going to get us there.
Yeah. So I'm going to do very few words, but you're going to do more about who you are personally. My viewers know me through the years, Don Baham. I've had a number of things I've done in the past because I'm 86 this year, and I won't talk about all of those because, again, we need too much time. But what comes to mind now is I started out many years ago as an aircraft mechanic and went back to school, became a clinical psychologist, had a practice for years in Southern California. And when I retired, I figured, what am I going to do to get into trouble? And I decided to have this talk show on cable access television. Been going on now for about 13 years. It's called Conversations with Dr. Don, and I interview all sorts of people, truck drivers, pizza makers, and whoever else, and people like you, and researchers, and anyhow, so you're here, and I'm here, and here we go. I was born in New Orleans, Louisiana, in 1928. And, I'm triracial for some people who are concerned about why it is I look the way that I do. I'm a recovering Roman Catholic. I'm now a skeptic and an atheist, not atheist, that's a pejorative. And I have 5 daughters, all grown and all delightful even till this day. And I have innumerable grandchildren and great-grandchildren. And when you get to be my age, you can count yours. I'm not going to count mine. And that's enough about me. Say a few words about who you are before we get into the subject of the show. Pledge to Amend, Rick, please.
Well, I'm a native of Portland, Oregon. Also, I live on the Oregon South Coast in Coos Bay, and I practiced psychiatry for a number of years until I resigned my position at the VA to run for the U.S. Senate because I wanted to promote the idea of making a constitutional amendment a campaign issue. And so I made it the focal point of my campaign when I ran against Wyden. And ever since then I've been pushing to get other people to understand that if we're going to pass the darn thing, it means we have to elect people like me who are willing to support that amendment. But personally, I'm married. I have 3 kids, 1 grandchild, who I'm always delighted to come here to Portland to see. And my dad's still alive. I'd like to come up and see him too. And what can I say? I have a whole life behind me, just like you, or most of a life.
Or are you going to run for the Senate again in the future?
I don't know. Some people have been encouraging me to, and I'm considering it, but it's a big leap. And if I do it this time, it would probably be for the Democratic Party, because that way it'll be harder to ignore my campaign. So we'll see. It depends on how serious people are about helping me do it this time.
So, all right. What else you want to say about you? That's personal. Before we go into.
You're not going to ask me any of your trick questions again?
Okay, you ready?
Sure, go ahead.
You said when you were born and where you were born, but you didn't say anything about why you were born.
You always are trying to trick me into theological questions.
Not necessarily.
I know. You just want me to make it that. No,
I don't.
Why was I born? I was born because this was before the era of birth control, probably.
I was born to be here and hang out with people like you and enjoy my existence.
There you go.
The first time I tried that one, that worked good.
Yeah, I mean, it's either somebody else assigned what you're here for, or you decide for yourself, and it sounds like that's what you decided for yourself. That's great. Me too.
That wasn't theological, was it?
No, it wasn't.
Okay, I got it.
I just always, I guess I'm paranoid after last time. And you accused me of being religious.
I did?
Yeah, just because I
Can I do it again and see what happens?
Not that I don't want to sound insulting to religion. I believe in God, but I think it's a private thing.
Of course.
Yeah.
Of course. I must confess, I think perhaps sometimes where I'm a little testy toward you is because I'm remembering way back when I was a clinical psychologist, and in California I was a QME, Qualified Medical Evaluator, and if there was a dispute over how a case should be decided for a person applying for a disability like that, and as a QME, there were only a few of us, I would get a collection of all the reports of the medical practitioners and chiropractors and psychiatrists and the whole thing. And this is my only chance to overrule the diagnosis of a psychiatrist.
Well, don't worry about it. I can certainly understand antipathy towards psychiatrists. I used to work with a lot of them.
I'm leaving. I'm not going to hang out here anymore. So before we take a break, shall we start into the main body of the program now?
By all means.
Pledge to amend. Where you started off, you're going to be talking about a constitutional amendment.
Yes.
Yeah. What is the proposed, much talked about constitutional amendment, and why is it needed?
Well, a lot of us, there's a whole movement, this, behind the move to amend the Constitution, which the basic thing that most of us agree on is we need to not only reform campaign finance, which pretty much everybody agrees on, overturn Citizens United at a minimum, but we also need to end the doctrine of corporate constitutional rights, which we frequently refer to as corporate personhood. The idea that corporations are people and therefore have constitutional rights, that's a fiction that was created by the Supreme Court in a whole series of decisions. We just want to throw it all out.
So you need to amend the Constitution for the reasons you just cited.
Well, the main reason is because the Supreme Court is the one that created corporate personhood and keeps overturning good campaign finance laws, or attempts at regulating campaign finance. So if the Supreme Court is going to write their own laws and interpret the Constitution to benefit the moneyed interests that dictate the electoral process, we need to deal with it through a constitutional amendment.
And that constitutional amendment will remedy that.
Well, that's the devil's in the details, of course.
Okay.
But there's so many different proposals out there that I personally think that it divides the movement when you start saying you got to do this, you got to do it this way, you got to do it that way. everybody agrees, or not everybody, but most of us agree that both those things have to be dealt with. How you do it, ultimately Congress is going to write the amendment, so we can start with any of the things that are on the floor, and then each group or individual can lobby their members of Congress. But in the end, they're the ones that are going to write it. So I think at this stage of the game, it's premature to demand that it be one amendment or another.
So the Supreme Court did this, decision.
Mm-hmm.
Why?
Well, they've always been conservative. You know, I mean, the law itself is conservative. You know, it's built on precedent. But when you take the precedent and you extend it just a little bit, you know, over and over and over, and always in the direction of the vested interest, the power interests,
sure,
then you end up with what we've got now, which is economic elite that vets our candidates. You can call it the corporate elite, because most of them are, you know, they operate through the corporate structure. They make laws that make it easier for corporations to acquire more and more power, and the individuals that run them, obviously. Yeah. Corporations are not people, but they are run by people, and those people are not held accountable. So why did they do it? They did it because that's the way they think. They're not evil people. I mean, it was a process. It started with saying that interpreting corporate charters as contracts, as opposed to a deal between, you know, a deal where the state gives special privileges, that's what the corporate structure is all about, giving special privileges to investors. And originally it had to be for the public good. Mm-hmm. Now the assumption is any corporation that makes money, it's for the public good, because somehow when the GDP grows, it's to all our benefit, which is not true. They simplify that and say, well, the corporations are the job creators, except the problem is they're creating jobs in China. And so this is something that it doesn't matter if you have a conservative or liberal background, you can understand when you put it that way. Corporations are not people. They're not job creators for the most part. And they certainly don't deserve to pick who we get to vote for.
So the GDP then is the primary consideration in the Supreme Court's decisions.
No.
Or what is?
But I'm saying that's the assumption behind giving corporations all these, not just privileges, but now constitutional rights. I really think the assumption is corporations are, the point I was making earlier is the assumption is corporations do a public good because they create wealth or they create jobs. But the fact of the matter is most of that wealth is going to the people at the top, and the jobs are going to people who speak Chinese.
So,
or right. Vietnamese or Indonesian, whatever.
So what are we going to do about the Supreme Court? Are we going to go along with it the way it's going here, or do we need to change it?
Well, unfortunately, the only way you can change it is somebody dies or retires, and I don't encourage people to hasten that process.
Nor do I.
So,
if
you were religious, you could pray that certain people might have heart attacks. And,
you're still paying me back for that question about your religion. All right.
But you know, and some people want to impeach Clarence Thomas, and there's good grounds for that. But the problem is the Senate impeaches, and they won't do it because they're, you know, on the take. So
I can't be impartial on your consideration of doing something about Clarence Thomas. I'm sorry.
Oh, that's right. You're Clarence Thomas in the Supreme Court night in all the demonstrations, right?
Yeah.
Well, yeah. The problem again, though, is that the Senate has to take responsibility, and they are the problem. The Senate primarily, but the House of Representatives also. And they're the ones that we need to get to pass an amendment. And since the people that are in office right now are so wholly dependent on the way things are to stay in office, half of them are totally unqualified. Their only qualification is they're millionaires. They're willing to do whatever their friends tell them to do. If we elect people who will pass this amendment, then I think that we will have people in office who will do everything else that needs to be done. Because the amendment's not enough. It's just a big first step.
So if we had a serious wealth tax, then those people in the Congress now would not have the money to buy the elections.
Well, they might have less incentive, but they don't have to have the money to do it. It's the people behind them. They don't use their own money for the most part.
Yeah.
But the problem is, again, we won't get that wealth tax either until we get rid of the ones that are in there now, who are vetted by the economic elite.
And you wanted to be a member of that team. You were running for the Senate. What would you do in there with your thinking?
I'd piss them all off.
Watch it. We have a family show.
I would not.
You'd be another Bernie Sanders.
I would step on toes. I would not have any fear of saying right there what I'm saying now.
Yeah.
I might say it slightly differently. It's not like I want to deliberately antagonize people, but I do want to throw the fear of God into them.
Give me a break. Okay, we're going to move on from that. Pledge to amend.
Yes.
What is the pledge to amend, Rick?
Well,
I can call you Rick, of course.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Pledge to amend is, in its essence, it's an attempt to make support for a constitutional amendment of this type a campaign issue, and ultimately a litmus test for our votes for any member who's running for Congress.
That's pretty harsh, huh?
I don't think so. I think it's exactly what needs to be done.
Yeah.
And apparently other people are starting to agree with me after 2 years of pushing this idea that Oregon Democracy Coalition is going to be, well, we are in the process of organizing something very similar to what I call Pledge to Amend. And I do want to say at the outset, I'm not speaking for the Oregon Democracy Coalition. I'm just one of the people involved in this campaign that they haven't named officially yet. And I'm trying to get them to call it Pledge to Amend because it is essentially the same thing I've been pushing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You talk about root strikers and demand progress. Those two organizations have announced a campaign to solicit pledges from presidential candidates to support the proposed constitutional amendment in 2016. Who are these people, root strikers and demand progress?
Well, you know, I don't know all the details about them, especially demand progress. I always assumed they were sort of a Democratic front group, like a lot of other groups that I won't name.
Mm-hmm.
I assumed that. I don't know it for a fact. But then I do know something about root strikers. Lawrence Lessig is associated with them.
Yes.
He's been pushing for a long time to deal with the corruption, and that's what root strikers means. The root of the problem is corruption, and they want to go after it. So they came up with this campaign to make candidates for the presidency in 2016 to support a constitutional amendment. I thought that was kind of cool when I came across this because it's a pledge strategy. Well, what that means is you promise to us that you will support this and then you can have our votes. You know, give your position. Are you running because you want to serve the people, or are you running because you want to serve the corporate interests? It's pretty cool. I don't think doing it with a presidential election is as important as doing it with Congress, because the president doesn't get to vote on a constitutional amendment, and we haven't had real leaders in the White House for quite some time either. I doubt they would push for something that their party wouldn't support. No matter whether they say they support it or not, they aren't doing anything about it as a party. Certain individual legislators are, both Democrats and Republicans, independents, like Bernie Sanders. There are people on both sides of the aisle and in the middle that have supported constitutional amendments. One of the nice things about Pledge to Amend is it is nonpartisan. And it's something that would give, say, a third-party candidate a chance to have an edge.
Who is Lawrence Lessig?
Lawrence Lessig?
Yeah.
He's with the Center for Media and Democracy, I believe,
Okay.
down in L.A. He's got a TED Talk that everybody should watch, and
He's a progressive leftist. What?
I don't use labels.
We don't have to. We can.
He's like Noam Chomsky. You know, if I was going to label him, and I don't. Libertarian socialist.
There's a difference between labeling and describing what a person is about.
Okay.
Because I can say what a person's about doesn't mean I'm labeling that person.
Well, all I would say is he's a good American because he cares about corruption in government, and I don't want to characterize it beyond that.
That's good enough for me. Yeah. Okay, where were we? I had another question for you. Why is there a campaign to solicit? Oh, the other question was, has this ever been done before in Washington, where there's been a litmus test for any person running for public office?
Well, yeah, many times actually.
Oh, really? Can you give one or
Probably
two?
the most famous example is the Grover Norquist pledge to
Oh, yes, of course.
no new taxes. But
And he got a bunch of signatures on that.
yeah, and you know that's funny because Susan Bonamici right here in Portland, when I asked her if she'd
Portland,
support,
Oregon.
yeah, when she was running in 2010, I asked her if she would support a constitutional amendment, excuse me, 2012, and she said she didn't want to take any pledges. That's a weasel cop-out, and we need to hold her responsible. This is the exact purpose of pledge to amend. To say I don't take pledges is equivalent, when we're talking about something like pledge to amend, is equivalent to saying I won't make any promises. Trust me. Vote for me.
Why would she do that?
I don't want to characterize her. I say her answer was weaselly. I'm not saying she's a weasel. I don't know why.
I'm not asking you to label her.
She
I'm
never
just asking you
explained. No,
why.
I know. I can't explain her motivation because she didn't try to justify it to me.
What's your hunch?
She's a politician.
That's enough.
That's enough.
Thank you.
She made a calculation and decided not to take a position, but she's virtually alone in Oregon's delegation, aside from Representative Walden. I think all of the other members of Oregon's delegation have supported one amendment or another. I could be wrong about that, but I know most of them have. Wyden, Merkley, DeFazio, Schrader, I think Blumenauer came out in favor of one or another. Like I said, there's a whole bunch of different amendments out there, but last time I heard, Susan Bonamici still had not come out in favor of any of them.
When she sees this show, she's going to.
I hope her constituents right here in Washington County will talk to her about it.
Washington County, Oregon.
That is the reason that we have the Pledge to Amend campaign.
What is this Oregon-originated effort called Free Speech for People? They can launch the Pledge to Amend idea nationally, which could inspire other groups to launch their own campaigns. What is this Free Speech for People?
Well, this is what happens when you translate my notes. I should. It's not an Oregon group.
We won't talk about your notes.
Yeah. Free Speech for People is a very good national group who's been working on this issue for some time. Jeff Clements, who wrote Corporations Are Not People, is one of the co-founders. John Bonifaz is the other. They're working on other issues and other approaches to dealing with corruption, but of course I'm most interested in their work on constitutional amendment. Let's see. They are working with...
That's a website too, huh?
Yeah, boy, you really did mess this up. Now I'm blanking.
We're not going to stop recording, so you can just stop it.
Free Speech for People is working with Represent Us, which was started by Dylan Radigan after he got so ticked off at corruption and ranted on MSNBC and then left because he couldn't stand it, the frustration. He started something called United Republic, and out of that came Represent Us. Represent, capital U, capital S. And they wrote something, took them 19 months to come up with this, called the Anti-Corruption Act. They had a lot of people involved, kicking around ideas. What will it take to deal with corruption on a legislative level? And they came up with a very detailed slate of legislation they call the Anti-Corruption Act. And the really cool thing is Free Speech for People, who wants a constitutional amendment, teamed up with Represent Us, and they came up with a petition that said support both these things. Now imagine if we incorporated that into a pledge to amend strategy. And the thing is, the Represent Us is also a pledge to amend strategy, so this could very well happen. Meaning, they are shooting for 1 million signatures on their petition, and when they get there, then they're going to say, look, all these people support this, and we want you to pass this. Will you or won't you? And that's a pledge. Give us your answer. Give us a pledge, because we're going to vote accordingly. So they're using a pledge strategy too. If they and Free Speech for People do that, This is a two-pronged approach for dealing with corruption, and both are necessary. A constitutional amendment and then subsequent legislation, or in this case, legislation at the same time that would clean up lobbying, the revolving door, and a lot of other aspects that a constitutional amendment can't easily address.
So you'd have both of them under one signature.
Yep, we go to, I know that Represent Us has that on the front page of their website. I don't know if Free Speech for People does. It should be there somewhere.
All right. The Anti-Corruption Act. Why is it needed?
Come on, Don. You know about the revolving door in Congress?
I do, and a lot of my viewers don't know. We have a broad range of people out there.
Yeah, I suppose people throw around terms like that and don't always define them, so let me do that.
Sure.
The revolving door, what that means is people go from industry to Congress, and they end up usually either on working for congressmen who are on committees that are supposed to regulate those industries, or they end up in the regulatory agencies. And then once they fix the rules to their benefit, then they go back to big business and make millions of dollars from the grateful industry.
Is that corruption?
I would say so. Yeah, that's the revolving door problem. And then there's the, like I said, lobbying. I don't need to define that. Everybody knows that people with the most money have the most access. And
I believe so.
yeah, and they prevent decent regulation. They're preventing implementation of Dodd-Frank right now, as weak as it is.
And Dodd-Frank is what?
I'm sorry. Dodd-Frank is the so-called banking regulation bill.
Yeah, yeah. Pardon me for keep prompting you like this, but and I know you deal with all kinds of people in your profession, but in this context, sometimes I have pizza makers out there, you know?
I know. I'm just so I feel like I'm just talking to you, Don. You're such a great host that I forget that sometimes.
Okay.
So don't feel free to prompt me.
Thank you.
You bet.
You bet. Free speech for people. Yeah, we just talked about that. President U.S. is teaming up about. You told me to throw away the second page, but I'm not going to. So there's few proposals in Congress that would abolish corporate personhood and reform campaign finance. Nolan-Pocan amendment. Who was Nolan and Pocan?
Well, Mark Pocan is from Madison, Wisconsin, and he used to be in the legislature, and he's one of the renegade Democrats that ran away so they wouldn't have a quorum to vote in all this crazy anti-union.
I like that term, renegade Democrats. That's a label I like.
Yeah, he's a renegade Democrat. He doesn't sit still for corruption. So people of Wisconsin like that, people in his district, and they elected him to Congress. And he introduced a constitutional amendment that meets the two criteria of establishing that money is not speech and abolishing corporate personhood or corporate constitutional rights.
Who's Nolan?
I don't know. I don't know his background. He's just the he's the person who co-introduced this. In fact, I think he's the first co-sponsor.
Yeah. McGovern, you mentioned in your notes. Is this a congressman or?
Yes.
Yeah.
McGovern introduced an amendment. I don't remember the details. He introduced one in 2012 that I believe tried to cover both.
Mm-hmm.
And what we have found out, what he found out and a lot of other people found out, is there's a lot of backlash against the idea of trying to end corporate constitutional rights. It's a complicated question that we won't necessarily get into.
Of course.
But there's a lot of opposition, and not just, I mean, it's not corruption, there's principled opposition, concerns about it. And so he split the two up. He introduced one amendment that would establish that money is not speech, and which is one way that people look at campaign finance reform. And the other one is to abolish corporate personhood. And that way people can decide on the questions on their own merits. Mm-hmm. So it's a different strategy. I don't think anybody really anticipated that somebody would do that. There was this struggle, though, within the amendment community about should we really push for both, or should we just focus on what most people are concerned about, which is campaign finance reform and the idea of money being speech. And that really was splitting the movement. So he came up with this Solomonic solution. And No,
You got to get religion in there.
he was a king. You know, it doesn't have anything to do with religion necessarily.
Sure.
He was a historical king, but so it's very interesting. It made the whole debate, threw another element into the whole debate about how we are going to accomplish this through an amendment or amendments in this case, if we use that strategy. So those are two ways that we could do it. My favorite is to take Bernie Sanders' amendment, which flat out abolishes any corporate campaign expenditures, whether they're from for-profit corporations or unions or any other kind of corporation. You can't take money right out of the treasury and use it to influence campaigns of any sort, not election campaigns, not petition campaigns, referenda or initiatives, ballot measures, in other words. You can't use it for any of that. And even though that's not where the biggest money comes from super PACs, but still it establishes the principle that corporations are not people and they cannot give money. And it also allows us to put limits on individual donations too, which all of the other amendments do too.
Do you think that the NSA has their drone program looking at Bernie Sanders?
No, because he's considered a nut. They can't imagine that we could actually elect a Senate that's dominated by people like Bernie. That's what Pledge to Amend is about electing a Senate that will represent us like Bernie does, and like Jeff Merkley does. Jeff Merkley, by the way, is the only co-signer of the Sanders Amendment. And we are, so our job with him, people that want to work on Pledge to Amend, our job with him is to try to convince him to add in a clause that would end corporate constitutional rights. Sanders had that in his 2012 version, but he took it out because some large national nonprofits who he was working with were concerned that their ability to get their message out was being compromised by certain politicians who were trying to restrict what they could say, what they could talk about, and label some of it, political speech, and therefore they're banned as 501c3s. They said their only protection was corporate free speech rights. Now, obviously, there are many of us in the movement who don't think that's true. They're not really part of the movement. They do support an amendment. That's why they were working with Senator Sanders, but they don't want it with a provision to abolish corporate personhood, and we think they're wrong.
So we've got Bernie Sanders and Merkley, and we've lost Paul Wellstone, and so we've got two. If we keep going, we may get more and change.
Well, we lost
Senate.
Kucinich and Feingold.
Thank you.
But see, that's that was then. If we make this a litmus test, this is the strongest test I can think of whether or not a person really wants to work for us or somebody else. He or she would be cutting off a major source of campaign funding.
And that's why you're going to go as a Democrat if you go next time.
Well, if I run at all for whatever party, I would do that. And I would seek the nomination of other parties even if I ran as a Democrat. You can have up to 3 parties nominate you and be on the ballot.
Will you go as a Republican also?
If I could get their support, I would get all of the parties. When I ran in 2010, I actually did get 2 different parties. 2 of them, I didn't get to their conventions because I didn't hear about them in time. The smaller parties are a little, you got to watch them closely. They're a little ad hoc sometimes.
Yes, yeah, I know of a few of them which you won't go into now. Talk about labeling. Oh.
Well, they're just a little ad hoc sometimes, but they're good people, all of them.
I got one more question now, and then we should take a break. But let's get this last question out of the way because who knows where we're going to go in the second half of the show, okay?
Sure.
The Oregon Democracy Coalition is organizing to bird dog House and Senate. I like that word, the bird dog. That's yours. I took that from your notes.
Yeah, well, that's a term they use a lot, but I don't think it's a good name for the campaign. But it's a term they use because that's a big part of it.
Organizing to bird dog House and Senate members and candidates about this matter. What the Oregon Democracy Coalition, what is the Oregon Democracy Coalition? You want to say a few words about that?
Well, I wish I could remember their old name, but I'm really glad they changed it because I think the new one's much easier to remember. That's more descriptive.
That's not a good excuse.
But what they are is they're a coalition of really major groups. Common Cause, Public Citizen,
Yes.
Main Street Alliance, Rural Organizing Project, and if you haven't heard about them, you really should check them out. These are very good groups. Along with a number of the Move to Amend affiliates and chapters, including the Portland chapter, are involved, and they are all working together now on something that's, as I said, substantially similar to Pledge to Amend. It doesn't have a name. That's a name I propose. But one of the main components is as you say, bird dogging. Organizing teams of people in every city where candidates are likely to show up or where incumbents do show up for town halls, so that we can put them on the spot in public and ask them, will you support this amendment? Along with, making some points that educate the audience as well as the politician if they're not aware of the issues. I wouldn't be surprised if Walden doesn't know anything about this, because I don't think anybody's ever really approached him much about it. I don't want to speak for him or anybody else, but I don't think he's ever probably really been approached about it. So we are organizing in Jackson County, for instance, his District 2, and there's a person down there who is working actively with Americans for Prosperity.
Greg Walden, a congressman.
Right. There's a person down there who's working actively with Americans for Prosperity, and they're very excited about the idea of a constitutional amendment. So we can maybe talk more about that in the second hour, because we absolutely have to have conservative support.
Is the Oregon Democracy Coalition going to become a legitimate organization with a website and all that jazz?
We have a website.
Okay.
There's not a lot on it, but it'll be developed. As I said, they were another organization, so they had to rebuild their They decided to rebuild their website. They've already gotten House Joint Memorial 6 passed in the last legislative session, calling for a constitutional amendment. So our Oregon legislature has already spoke up and say they want this amendment. That meant the coalition had to go on and do something else to educate the public, and in this case, not only educate the public about the problem, but about the solution.
So there's discussion and looking at these issues in Salem, our capital in Oregon, and on the national level too.
Ultimately, yes. We hope this campaign, speaking for myself, I hope and expect this campaign to go national.
Well, we should take a break here, even though we're running late. Can we take a break for a few minutes and take a breath?
I'm encouraging us to do that.
Okay, we are back, and now I've got to tell you what you're watching. Thanks for staying tuned. And for you viewers who missed the opening of the show, Conversations with Dr. Don, that you're watching is an ongoing series of one-hour standalone talk shows where I interview interesting people like my friend over here, Dr. Rick Stegenborg, about who he is, and you heard about that in the first half. And we talk somewhat about Pledge to Amend, and we're going to resume that and then talk about whatever else seems to be coming up during the last half of the show. So where shall we start in the second half, Ray?
Well, you know, I got to thinking about some of the questions you asked me in the first half, and the fact that we really need to step back sometimes and just give the big picture.
Okay.
And I think really taking the really big picture, I assume people understand corruption is the root of all of the problems, but people don't understand that. I know that for a fact. We talk about this need for a constitutional amendment to start to deal with corruption in U.S. government, and people go, you know, you're right. And then they're off parading against Walmart or protesting the latest war without realizing that all those things are connected to corruption in government.
And you mentioned earlier what you mean by corruption.
By corruption,
generally,
I mean, yeah, like the influence of lobbyists with lots of money, the revolving door process between industry and the congressional regulators. They just go back and forth from one to the other. And then, of course, campaign finance is totally corrupted by money. And
so with the corruption, then the people who are supposed to represent us don't represent us,
exactly,
bottom line.
Exactly. So what are we going to do? You know, I talk about corporate constitutional rights, but I didn't give you any examples other than to say that they have this right of free speech and money is speech. So those kind of things go together. But there are other issues too. Like, for instance, if Walmart wants to put a store in somewhere and the town doesn't like it, they can sue for discrimination based on 14th Amendment rights that they claim to have. And they've done it, and they've won. So that's relevant right here to Oregon, because there is a Walmart going in Tigard,
Oregon.
And people are going to be out protesting that tomorrow, and I'll be with them. But that's just a different kind of a corporate constitutional right that the Supreme Court created out of thin air. So corporations have rights that people
So
don't
that
have.
isn't corruption then, if that's a law that's okay by the Supreme Court.
Well, that's a good point.
Okay, I'll be aggravating you.
No, you're not, absolutely. No, that's a good point, seriously, because the law is not necessarily just. Everybody's probably heard the saying that Oliver Wendell Holmes said, this is not a court of justice, this is a court of law. And so if you go back and look at legal history of the U.S., you will see that the laws were written to support the power elite, and they've been interpreted by the Supreme Court to benefit the power elite. For instance, the accretion...
Will you repeat what Oliver Wendell Holmes said? That's important enough. I want to hear it again.
Somebody asked him about, you know, is there no justice in this court? And he said, this is not a court of justice. This is a court of law. Well, laws are written by men, and the men who write them are put in place by the economic elite. They always have been. And they write rules that benefit them. Big surprise. Yeah. So just because something's legal or illegal doesn't mean it's moral or immoral.
Okay.
Those are completely separate things, and Holmes was making that point.
Doesn't mean it's just.
Doesn't mean it's just or unjust, right? And increasingly, of course, the law is becoming irrelevant anyway, because we have a president who does, you know, breaks the law all the time. Congress lets him get away with it. Congress writes laws that are clearly unconstitutional, like the National Defense Authorization Act, Patriot Act, things that violate our 4th, 6th, 5th Amendment rights. All the time, they take away our rights while they're giving rights to corporations.
Are you going to mention a few things that our president is doing that's against the law or wrong?
Well, he authorized strikes on Libya, which is a sovereign country. That's against international law because they hadn't attacked anybody. You know, he claimed it was humanitarian intervention. What's that? I mean, Hitler could have said that. Oh, they need my help in Sudetenland. You know, they need my help in Poland. Look how they're being oppressed by whatever.
You always charm me with your knowledge about those kinds of things. You got a heck of a brain.
Well, there are strong parallels between Hitler regime and I'm not blaming Obama in particular, don't get me wrong.
Sure.
It would be the same, obviously, with Mitt Romney. In fact, I think it would have been worse because Romney made it clear he wouldn't hesitate to bomb Iran if Israel told him to.
Israel told him to? Is Israel that powerful?
Well, Israel asked them to take positions. Netanyahu came and spoke to Congress, which, by the way, was an unprecedented honor, came and spoke to Congress and basically dressed Obama down in the American position. And Congress applauded. They had something like 60 standing ovations while he was speaking.
What did Obama do?
A sitting prime minister of another country, the only one that's ever done this.
That's not another country. That's a creation.
Okay, we could argue details, but the point is,
okay, we won't.
The point is that he demanded that they take a position. Would you support us if we attacked Iran during a presidential election? And there were many prominent Democratic Jews who stood up and said, "What the hell? He's trying to influence the election." Well, Romney immediately kissed his toes and said, "Yes, of course," or words to that effect. That's not a quote.
Are you an anti-Semite?
No, of course not.
Well, some people would say that you are because you're not supporting Israel's wish that America support them in attacking Iran.
Israel claims the Israeli government claims to speak for all Jewish people, and they don't. Jewish Voice for Peace is strongly opposed to most of the Israeli policies, occupation, discriminatory laws.
Well, some people would say that that organization is self-hating Jews. Let me stop digressing.
Well, their best campaign ad, I thought, was a picture of 4 young people and it says, "I'm Jewish and I'm proud and AIPAC doesn't speak for me." Wow. It was a great campaign. Wow. I really like that organization. They're not, well, I don't want to get into too much detail. I just really like that organization for a lot of reasons.
So where else are we going to go now?
Where were we before we got off on that side trip? We were talking about how you were asking about illegalities, and we got talking about.
Yes.
We didn't get into detail about the illegal actions of the Israeli government, but we talked about how they work hand in hand with the U.S. government in its illegal actions.
And you mentioned Obama is authorizing some of the things that's done, like in Libya, and drone warfare, those kinds of things. What else has he done that's illegal in the eyes of the World Organization?
Well, yeah, I don't really sit around and think about it much in terms of that. I just think about what I agree with and disagree with. The point is, though, that international law is being broken every time that we interfere with another nation's sovereignty with the intent of taking it down. Whether we are funding terrorist gangs in Libya and Syria, whether we are funding neo-Nazis in Ukraine, it's all illegal under international law. I mean, the
funding neo-Nazis in Ukraine? Where'd you get that from?
Oh, just about any source but the New York Times. And even the New York Times admits the neo-Nazis and Nazis are involved. They just try to make it sound like they're not running the show. Well, they aren't running the show, but they are. Everything is a reaction to what they're doing.
Yeah. Is it okay to put this sign up now? It seems to fit into what they're talking about. But the other side?
You know what? The thing is, most Americans would love to see the end of war. The problem is that when the government says, well, this is a good war, then too many of them say, oh, okay, well, this time it's okay. And they do it every time. They never stop and ask, why are we really there? You know, most people, when we went to Iraq the first time, knew we were there for oil. They didn't even try to cover it up. People said, what are you going to do? We need our oil. As if attacking Iraq
our oil.
And destroying
their land.
As if that wasn't the we didn't depend essentially on that anyway. And he didn't have an army. You know, they called him worse than Hitler. He wasn't going to start running all over the world. He didn't have that kind of an army. He did have an army, you know, and it was
that we helped create.
And Israel considered it a threat, and they wanted us to take them out. And people in Project for a New American Century, and I forget the strategy for rebuilding the Mideast, 96, Project for a New American Century, 2000. There's position papers.
Yes.
Funded by corporations that profit from war, by the way. All said this, and it was right in line. The neocon strategy was right in line with what the Israeli right-wingers were talking about at the same time. So it goes hand in hand, and you know, when you assume that Israel's interests are our own, it makes it very easy to sell that. You know, a plan where everything they want neatly fits into what the people who are starting all these wars want.
A few words. What's a neocon for a few people who haven't looked at what that means?
Very good question. Neoconservative.
Yeah.
Called neoconservative because they're not conservatives. Just like neoliberals are called neoliberals because they're not liberals.
Ah.
What they are is they're two sides of something that's entirely new. Neo-fascism.
Do we have neo-fascism raising its ugly head anywhere in the world now, like in America?
Well, yeah, absolutely. See, let me just go a little deeper though. Neoconservatism usually is referring to war policies. You know, we have to control the Mideast because we need the oil or whatever, or we need democracy, whatever excuse you want. It's really about resources. War always is in the end. So those are that's neoconservatives. And so is that a Republican thing? Well, if it is, then why is Obama and half the Democrats behind all this, or more than half of the Democrats behind these wars? Neoliberalism, on the other hand, is like free trade. It's economic policies that are coercive and exploitative. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, for instance. But if you look at these things carefully, they're just two different ways to control other countries. And if you put them together, what the assumption behind them is that somehow the U.S. and its allies has some sort of God-given right or mission even.
You're getting religious on me again.
Or mission even. Well, they're religious about it. You know, it's like you don't question this. It's a fundamental tenet of their propaganda, which so many Americans have faith in. You know, if the government says go to war, then we need to get behind them. Our country, right or wrong, blah blah blah. The funny thing is, though, that the people that are most likely to just reflexively support any war that the government proposes are the same people who hate the government and want to get rid of it. And they say the only purpose of the government is to defend this country. So if the government says, well, we have to go kill Gaddafi or we have to kill Hussein because they're bad people and that's in our national interest, I say, oh, okay.
All right. Time is running out, but I have one last question for you.
We didn't talk about Pledge to Amend. Ask me about that.
About what?
Pledge to Amend, the name of the show. We only mentioned bird dogging. There's more to it. I do encourage people to go to my website, Soldiers for Peace International.
You got about a minute more to talk about Pledge to Amend, but you were taking the lead in the second half.
I'm going to say, I know. Well, you got me diverted on some stuff.
Of course I did.
But if you go to Soldiers for Peace International well, just go to soldiersforpeaceinternational.org, and there's a special page, Pledge to Amend. It describes it in more detail, but just really quickly, in addition to bird dogging the candidates at town halls and other appearances, we are also encouraging regular contact. So these teams that we're forming in towns around the state and hopefully around the country can keep regular relationships going with their members of Congress. I am also encouraging people to do letter writing campaigns so that this idea stays out in the public eye. Just regularly write letters to the editor, and one person can write many letters, you know, maybe one a month for most papers. But if a bunch of people are doing it, you can keep that in the public consciousness. Letter writing is much more important than most people realize.
All right. Last question, we have a minute for it, is what is a good war? You mentioned it.
A good war?
Yes.
Well, I said that's part of the propaganda. There is no
course.
such thing as good war. War is an obsolete concept in a civilized society. But we are not a civilized society. In fact, we're degenerating. We're becoming less civilized. As war becomes more acceptable, as our children grow up in a society that's never known peace, or that doesn't even hide the fact that we're not at war, because we've been at war since we founded the country, one kind or another. But now they're being asked to serve in war after war after war, and they just take it for granted, wouldn't you? If you grew up and nobody protested?
What's going to happen to America in the next 10 years?
Depends on whether or not people get into the Pledge to Amend campaign. I think it's that important. I really do.
Yeah. It's always a pleasure having you on. Always a pleasure.
My pleasure too, Don.
It challenges my thinking and questioning, and occasionally I'll hear something I haven't quite heard before, so I'm still learning, and You going to come back on again?
Love to.
You better. So shall we start shutting down, Mr. E, or whatever? Rick, stop smiling at me. So we have some public broadcast, public service announcements here. To get my local broadcast schedule, go to my website and click on present day activities. Next one, to watch my shows on the web, go to my website again and click on favorite links. And to learn more about the ACLU, go to the ACLU website, and there's a phone number. The American Civil Liberties Union. Without the ACLU, our civil liberties would be further down the tubes than they are. And to get my shows broadcast by other stations in other parts of the country where you're watching on your local public access station, go to pegmedia.org and follow the instructions to have my shows broadcast directly from your local public access station over there. And to end corporate personhood, go to movetoamend.org and learn how to end corporate personhood, which is so critically important to save this wonderful experiment called democracy. Thanks for watching. Thanks really for watching. And remember, KFC, not Kentucky Fried Chicken, Dr. Don's KFC. Kind, friendly, and charitable. You too, and you too, and you too, and you too in the control room, especially you, nurse. Thanks again for watching, and good night.